Well, first of all, Phil, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And it really is an honor to be here to share my passions for what I believe is the most fascinating time that I could have ever imagined, right? And so roughly 250 years ago, the American Revolution started right here in Boston. And we are now living through a revolution that is equally profound. It will change life completely. And let me just a little bit more context so you know where I'm coming from. Former Silicon Valley engineer, Yale MBA, McKinsey strategy consultant, then co-founded 8 VC-backed tech startups, 2 of which went public on the NASDAQ. Others were acquired by people like IBM and Oracle. But about 22 years ago, after my second IPO, I wound up being invited to teach at MIT Sloan as they were establishing their entrepreneurship center. And I fell in love with teaching instantly. And as a result of that, I've been teaching now for 22 years simultaneously while I've been operating as an entrepreneur. Most of the work I do these days is at Harvard, but I'm spending time in a lot of universities, largely doing exec ed training around the world on the subject of AI. And what I will share with you is that, a year or 2 years ago, if I was in the Middle East, if I was in Saudi Arabia or Dubai or Kuwait, there wasn't a lot of real understanding of what AI was. I can tell you that recent classes, the world has really caught up, okay? The gap has closed. So I think it's a very important thing to understand, okay? So the way I want to take us through today's talk is there's 3 pieces. It's always important to understand history and context. How did we get here? Significant part of the time I want to talk about is the present, right? Beginning with that meteor strike, which was ChatGPT 3.5 in November of 2022. Talk about some of the visionaries who really understood the implications of what this meant from a business point of view and how they took early action to harness this power. Okay, and then I want to spend a lot of time talking about what's happening here in Boston. As Phil has said, right, there's a remarkable AI community, and we've had some very interesting early adopters that have really set the pace for the rest of the industry. And then importantly, I want to talk about where we go from here. What should we all be thinking about as we leave this conference, right? The rate of improvement combined with the cost reductions we've seen is unprecedented. It makes Moore's Law look like child's play. It's extraordinary how much has changed. Behold the Agentic Era. Last October, we were at the GAI Insights Conference, and everybody was dismissing Agentic AI as hype. And then on the Super Bowl, we have Salesforce.com's Agent Force being advertised. I'm listening to my Morning Brew Daily podcast this morning, and ServiceNow is advertising their Agentic AI, right, on a general interest podcast. Wow, okay? And then the future of work. And although I don't have a crystal ball, there's a lot of really interesting insights that I think we want to really, truly absorb. Because the way that we work today and the way that we work 2 years from now will be fundamentally different, and I guarantee that. So some of us in the room are old enough to have lived through maybe 1 or 2 of these massive societal shifts. And so if you look at, right, just to understand context, it's not like we haven't seen this movie before. We have lived through, and we're now living through, the 6th wave of innovation. We go back to industrial England in the 1780s, about the time that the United States American Revolution was being fought. And what you see across the horizontal is these 6 different waves of innovation. Every single one of these was driven by a very small but very important number of innovations and inventions. Okay? And each of them really did change life as we know it. And what's interesting is what we also see is those organizations that were leaders in one era, if they were slow to adopt the latest innovations, they became roadkill. Okay? If they did not take advantage of the latest technology, they disappeared from the face of the earth. What's interesting is every one of these eras, as you go closer to our time, they compressed by a factor of 2. They basically collapsed in half. And everything here was about, all of the inventions were about fortifying human strength and capability, but not intellectual capability, not cognitive capability. That's what makes the generative AI innovation ecosystem so extraordinary. But what you also see is we move from the world of physical atoms with inertia and mass to digital bits, right? Data goes across the internet at around 2/3 the speed of light. Okay, think about that for a second, right? So we see massive data and information flows. And so everything starts to accelerate as we enter into the digital era. And you can argue when did the digital era start? Some might say it started when the Netscape browser was introduced. I would argue it started around the time that AWS was introduced in 2006. And the iPhone was introduced in 2007. That's really when we saw this massive inflection point around digital, okay? And let's be clear, AI is not new. And some of you have heard of the Turing test, Turing test. The Turing test was coined by the great British computer scientist and cryptographer Alan Turing. And we've had a 75-year runway to get to where we are. And there were a lot of fits and starts. And there were periods in history when if an academic said that they were studying artificial intelligence, they were basically dismissed as lunatic fringe, okay? Just, it's not going to happen. How many of you recognize this company? And I'm not talking about the company that Mira Murati just started, the former CTO of OpenAI. But we actually had kind of a false positive in Boston, in Cambridge, in the 1980s, right? So think about being 40 years ahead of your time, okay? But the company noticed Thinking Machines, and they had two competitors. One was called Lisp Machines. One was called Symbolics, right? They made a go at commercializing AI at scale. They received a lot of funding from DARPA, from Citicorp, GE Ventures. They got $125 million in traditional VC, and yet it was 40 years too early, okay? That's incredible, right? But that's the history of technology. And if you know Amara's law, this is classic, right? Which is we overestimate the effect of technology in the short term. Think about the dot-com boom. Think about what happened during the dot-com implosion. But can you imagine not having Amazon or Netflix today? So once it kicks in, it takes over. And so let's fast forward to November of 2022. A meteor strikes the Earth, and it is ChatGPT 3.5. Now, what makes this so interesting is that when the founders of this company launched this into the world, they had no idea what they had wrought. They thought this was going to be a little pilot test. They would have, a relatively small number of users. They'll get some feedback. And boy, were they wrong. Now, what's really interesting about what happened here, so, a lot of you know the name Dario Amodei. Before he became the founder of Anthropic, he was one of the senior researchers within OpenAI. And he just, for kicks, said, you know what, I'm just going to see if, this will write code for me. He had no idea, no expectations that this could write code. And he was blown away that not only could it write code, he said it wrote code in the same sort of logic thought process that I would have written the code. Okay? So they had no idea, and they're still saying we really don't truly understand how these models work, even though we're 2.5 years into this revolution. Okay? Now, what makes this interesting is they weren't selling us a packaged product. This was not an application. This was not a solution. This was a model. And so there was no real understanding of how this model could be used, okay? And so what we found through grassroots curiosity and experimentation is this model could do pretty much damn anything you wanted it to do, right? There were thousands of use cases that you could do, and different people would download, whether they were using the free version or the pro version, and they would just say, hey, I'm not going to blow the world up. Let me try this. And the next thing you know, you've got all of these different use cases, okay? And so I love this quote, and that is, there is danger in reckless change, but there is greater danger in blind conservatism. And this is exactly what we saw when ChatGPT 3.5 was first released into the world. There were a lot of CEOs that said, not in my company. right? We're going to circle the wagons. We're going to build a fortress around the company, and you are forbidden to use this capability. Wrong answer, because people were bringing it to work anyway, but they were using consumer-grade tools, which leads to the kinds of incidents like Samsung experienced, where a bunch of young engineers were developing very important code using a consumer version of OpenAI, and then you have IP leakage. So the most reckless thing you can do is not have a policy on usage within the company, okay? And so what's interesting is there were a number of very visionary CEOs that got the memo. They understood instantly what the implications of this profoundly unique technology were. And what makes it interesting is a lot of them come from very conservative, very highly regulated industries. So we've got Jamie Dimon, the head of the biggest bank in the United States and one of the most respected bankers in the world. We've got the great John Halamka, who for many years was the chief information officer of the Harvard Medical School in the Partners Healthcare system, and who's now running the Mayo Clinic, what they call the digital platform today. You've got Stéphane Bancel, who is the CEO of Moderna. And these were executives that instantly understood that they needed to take action, and they did. And I'll talk about what they did in a little while, okay? They understood it was a force multiplier. And so let's look at some of the examples of what some of the companies who have used this have benefited. We probably all have heard that Sundar Pichai, the head of Google, came out and said that they were writing about 25% of their production code using AI. He upgraded that to about 30+% recently. Satya Nadella, the head of Microsoft, came out just a couple of days ago. He was at the Meta conference on stage and goes, we're writing about 30% of our code using AI. You've got Andy Jassy, who was the founding CEO of AWS and now the CEO of Amazon. The average time to upgrade an application to Java 17 plummeted from typically 50 developer days to just a few hours. Think about that. So he goes on to say, we saved 4,500 developer years in a single year, amounting to over $250 million in savings for the company. Wow. 1 year, one use case, okay? And so McKinsey, you got to love the complexity of McKinsey charts. They put together a heat map. And the heat map has been extremely helpful, actually, because if you look at the horizontal, what you see is all of these different functional roles that exist in the company. And if you look at the vertical, you look at a whole range of industries. And of course, the darker the blue, the more intensive the impact. And what they rightly identified is where do you get the most impact? And these are all of the sweet spot, low-hanging fruit use cases that almost any company using AI has found a lot of success with. The IT group, sales and marketing, product and service development, customer service operations, software engineering, right? So this is the roadmap that I think most of us who are in organizations that are seeing success are benefiting from, okay? One of the early poster children is Klarna. Klarna is a buy now, pay later fintech app. They're out of Sweden. None of us really think of Sweden as the center of innovation, but this founding team, basically the weekend after ChatGPT 3.5 dropped, they hunkered down and they started experimenting, and by the end of the weekend, they walked out of this little management offsite and said, we are going to lean in completely. We're going to be an AI-first company. And they've reported some stunning results. But in just one of the use cases, they launched 30 marketing campaigns using generative AI in 2024. They said they doubled the number of campaigns they could usually run. They slashed their external social media and image creation agency costs by 25%. They compressed the amount of time it took to develop an image from 6 weeks to 1 week. And they automated 80% of their copywriting using AI, okay? They wound up growing their revenue by 16% with no incremental expense, okay? I mean, that's magic, right? Any CFO will sign up for that, right? Now, let me talk about one, what I would call textbook example of how every company should have responded. Let's look at J&J. We all know the company, okay? And so they did what I think any strategist would recommend. Let's let all of our people experiment with this capability. And they wound up with about 1,000 use cases that they had been piloting, okay? And of course, 1,000 use cases will make your head explode. So the CIO basically said, not only have we seen the Pareto principle in action, it's really the Pareto principle on steroids. It's not 80-20, it's 90-10. We're getting 90% of the value out of 10% of our use cases. So let's pull all of our wood behind a handful of arrows that are going to really drive value for the company. One of them is the Rep Copilot. Remember, they are, one of their primary businesses is pharmaceuticals. And so it takes a lot of knowledge if you're a sales rep calling on physicians, surgeons, to talk about drugs. And so they created a tool that would coach sales reps on how these new treatments worked, what the side effects were, significant impact. This is a second one, and almost every company that's done this has reported remarkable savings. At the end of the day, if you're a large company, you have a lot of employees that have a lot of questions every day about their benefits, okay? So this is a classic HR bot, and they're getting 10 million annual interactions with this bot. So you can imagine the savings that ensues. Drug discovery, right? We all know that a typical clinical trial is a 10-year plus, $10 billion plus investment. And so they're optimizing the process by identifying that perfectly suitable time when you bring solvents in to create the next molecule, okay? And then finally, they depend heavily on China for a lot of chemicals that go into their drug process, okay? And if we're cut off, a lot of our drug makers are in serious jeopardy. So they have another one that is all about mitigating supply chain risk and really trying to predict when some of these really important materials are no longer coming at the rate that they need them, right? So this is just a great example of a company that did it, I think, in a textbook way, okay? Now, what's really interesting, this comes from the KPMG Quarterly Pulse Survey. It's just about a week old now. What we're seeing is the number of people who are at work using AI as a productivity tool has more than doubled, right? That's a remarkable thing to see in the enterprise, to see it's really 2.5 times in just 3 months. I've seen this in my own Harvard classes. Up until this quarter, and one of my students, Claudia, is here today, up until this quarter, this new semester, even though it's Harvard and you got some really bright students, they just weren't really leaning into the use of AI, and I was really shocked by that. Like, why? And by the end of the quarter or semester, they would be, because I'm insisting they use it in class. But in this instance, in January when they showed up, it was a completely different ballgame, right? They're much more conversant, much more comfortable with AI. So I've seen this with my own eyes, not just in the corporate world, but also in the education sector. More and more are using these tools as knowledge assistants, right? Using retrieval, automated generation, and uploading massive numbers of documents, and I'll talk about some of those, right? And AI, or Agentic AI, is already being embedded into a significant number of existing workflows, okay? Now, people are making money. So let's look at our friends from OpenAI. First year in business, $4 billion in annual revenue. Wow. Second year in business, they're reporting $11.6 billion. That's their projection for this year. And oh, by the way, they're looking at a $34 to $35 billion top line in 2027. I think VCs would like that model. What do you think? Okay. Now, look at how long it took some of these other great companies. Now, TikTok is a bit of an outlier, because TikTok was pretty flat until COVID. COVID really was a significant reason for the success of TikTok. Everybody was sitting at home with nothing to do, and it really created quite an incredible adoption that probably would have never quite happened the same way without this once in a millennial event. But you just look at how steep this curve is, right? It's straight up. And then you look at some of the hyperscalers and you look at their revenue per employee, and just a really dramatic increase, okay? Another set of companies that are making a lot of money are the strategy consultants that are doing AI consulting, or the systems integrators, right? So there's a lot of money to be made. Now, while all this has been happening, AI has not stood still, okay? It's been improving. Continuous improvement almost seems like an understatement, okay? So, I don't know about you, But when I wake up every morning, the number of podcasts I listen to, blogs I look at, LinkedIn posts, news media reports, right? I'm drinking from a fire hose and I'm still not keeping up. It's insane, okay? And so I love this quote, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. I think it's as appropriate as any time in my lifetime, okay? And so we look at sort of the more traditional generative AI model, right? The ChatGPT 3.5, 4.0, right? And we have these two step functions. But the most recent step function occurred in Q1 when everyone in the space tripped over themselves to release a reasoning model. And what was amazing is they made these reasoning models available to us for free, okay? It's a land grab. The value that we are getting from these companies, because they're raising hundreds of billions of dollars of venture capital, who are subsidizing our usage. It's incredible. Have we ever had anywhere near these kinds of capabilities at our fingertips for free or for 20 bucks a month, which is essentially free? No. And so if we look at the way that this market has developed, in 2023, OpenAI had a huge head start. And you had mostly the usual suspects, the other big AI labs, right? By 2024, OpenAI had not really advanced very much, but you brought on some new entrants like DeepSeek out of China, which of course freaked out the Americans big time, okay? And then Musk, being Musk, was able to raise insane amounts of capital, build this massive AI factory in Memphis. And if we look at 2025, this huge step function, but we're all more or less going back and forth now. This is now a horse race. This is no longer one dominant company. Right now, Google's bot is incredibly powerful after a really shaky start. But here's where it gets interesting. You look at the difference between 4Omni, the traditional generative model, versus o1, their first reasoning model. The first one is any math geeks in the room, anybody ever take this AIME test? This is a 15-question, 3-hour test that will make your head explode, okay? That's pretty much what it's about. Look at the improvement. So GPT-4 Omni, 13.4% accuracy. You now go to o1 reasoning, you get to 83+% accuracy, okay? In one fell swoop. You look at this Codeforce, which is the global Olympics of software engineering, and you go from getting 11 answers, or 11% right, to almost 90% correct with one model upgrade. And finally, Google has this PhD level science test. GPT-4 came in at about 56%, jumped up to 78%, but now it's actually even smarter than an expert in their own field. So if you're in physics, this is actually going to outperform a physics PhD. Okay? Wow. Crazy. So the other thing that's amazing is that while the capability increases, the cost is falling off the cliff. So if we look at what are inference costs, the way that you measure an inference cost is it's a blend of the tokens that are inputted into the system and the tokens that come out of the system. And you typically look at 1 million tokens and you say, what does it cost to process 1 million tokens? Well, back in the early days of GPT-4, it cost $37.50 to process 1 million tokens. And then dramatic drop when you had GPT-4 Turbo, which was a smaller model. And oh, by the way, the performance isn't changing, okay? You get down to $4.50 or 40 cents with Omni, and then you get to 4Omni Mini, you're now at 30 cents. So that is a 125-time improvement. Now, and what's interesting is this takes place over a period of 18 months. What is Moore's Law about? Every 18 months, computing power doubles, and the price falls in half. So if this followed Moore's Law, this would be so it would be half at about $18, $19, right? Still quite expensive. So whereas even Moore's Law, with all of this incredible exponential growth, doesn't come close to what we're seeing. And the implications are very straightforward. When it becomes this cost effective, it makes it very, very accessible for any organization or any individual to harness this power, okay? And so now let's come to our favorite city, okay? And let's talk about Boston. Boston, by the way, if you look at the number of AI job postings in the state in 2024, there are about 30,000 job postings within the state of Massachusetts. And if you look at all of the companies that are sort of in this very dark blue, we're very comparable to New York, we're very comparable to Virginia, to Georgia, Washington State, right? So there's a lot of us that are sort of in that same category of about 4.5% of our jobs are here in this area. Not surprisingly, California, 103,000 job postings last year, represents about 16% of all jobs that have been posted for AI in a single year, okay? Just to give us some context. So now let's look at a couple of the companies that we know, right? So this is, of course, an iconic company, John Hancock, the most famous signatory of the American Declaration of Independence. And what I really find interesting is insurance companies, whether it be John Hancock, whether it be Travelers, whether it be the Hartford Group, they have never been known as early adopters of technology. And trust me, as an 8-time entrepreneur, I have tested that theory, and it has been verified 100% of the time. And yet, in this new era, right, so I'm also a judge in the MIT CIO Symposium, and 2 of our 3 finalists come from insurance companies. And they've been unbelievably aggressive in using AI within their operations. So John Hancock is really doing some amazing work, right? A lot of the use cases are very similar to the use cases that we saw with Johnson & Johnson. And one of the things that they're doing at John Hancock that's so interesting is they're really trying to change the way that we think about life insurance by giving us a lot more access to our digital health data to help us make many more informed decisions that will allow us to live longer lives, okay? And so they're integrating sort of a lot of healthcare data with a lot of risk data. And so, of course, they've given a chatbot to their customer support team. That's always one of the first things any company does. They're seeing a 40% reduction in time of resolution of a customer support ticket. Okay, they've increased their sales conversion rate because, like J&J, they're making their reps smarter. Okay, they've handed out a productivity tool, and they're giving their employees a 30% amount of time savings. And their digital processing rate has increased, so they're becoming more and more digital as an organization. Okay, now as an educator, and of course we are in the hub of world education here. Here's an example. So Harvard Business School, for the very first time, rolled out a required AI course for all students. It's called DSAIL. So Data Science and AI Leadership. So this is not an engineering school course. This is a Harvard Business School course, and it's a very hands-on, very, very practical course. Okay? So this is a great sign. The HBS is really moving quickly on making sure that their leaders are AI literate. And they're also starting to understand how to use agentic AI. And so one of the things you're going to be able to do, if you're so interested, if you're working on a venture, is they've created this new thing called the Foundry AI. And it's basically agentic AI powered by Harvard Business School entrepreneurship faculty. So you can interact with the avatar, if you will, of a Harvard Business School entrepreneurship professor. Okay, it just went into beta like yesterday. Okay, that's how new this is. Okay, let's look at healthcare. We are the world's healthcare center. Okay, some of the world's greatest teaching and research hospitals, and of course we have the life sciences industry, right? The first FDA approval for AI in radiology actually goes back 20 years. But things really started to accelerate in about 2016. So I don't know how many of you know who John Halamka is, but he was the CIO of Harvard Medical School. There's nobody on this planet that is doing more to make sure that the healthcare industry is adopting AI. And why? Because it's working so incredibly. It's augmenting doctors' ability to diagnose and detect like never before. So, he goes on to say that the development of AI and machine learning outcomes has the potential to revolutionize diagnostic medicine, and it already is. So this is something that is desperately needed. I don't think I have to tell you the amount of depression, anxiety, burnout, and suicide amongst our primary care physicians is at an all-time high. They are overwhelmed by seeing 18 patients a day and then the tyranny of having to upload clinical notes into electronic health records. So we have a company called Abridge that is actually automatically capturing those notes in voice form, converting them into text, spell checking them, making sure that they're accurate, and literally saving doctors 4 or 5 hours a day. And we've seen the depression and the anxiety of doctors fall from 70% to 25% in just a few months, okay? So these things really help. And then we look at just how extraordinarily capable, and this is actually already a year and a half old, okay? Google has, because of DeepMind, they've been very focused on AI. So they have a model which is fine-tuned for the American Medical Association. And if you look at, this is about the ability to diagnose a patient's illness. And it comes from the New England Journal of Medicine, 302 different primary care cases, 20 board-certified internists with almost a decade of experience each. And look at what the numbers tell us. A clinician doing it the old-fashioned way, the way they were trained in medical school, their accuracy is on this blue line. A physician with the ability to do like a Google-style search, that's their capability. A physician with a chatbot, an LLM, fine-tuned, there's here, and then the chatbot by itself is here. Now, I did what are called grand rounds at the University of Connecticut Teaching Hospital about 3 weeks ago. I was in front of dozens of physicians and residents. And you can imagine what it must be like to have spent 17 years of your life studying medicine, going through the hazing of residency, okay, finally becoming a doctor, and then seeing that a bot is way better at diagnosing a patient than you are. That's got to be a pretty humbling thing. But in my mind, if you're a physician and you're not leveraging these tools, you are basically committing medical malpractice, okay? There's no reason why medical doctors should not be using these tools given this chart. And it's the same thing in the world of detection of cancer. So in this instance, this comes from The Lancet, which is kind of one of the most prestigious British medical publications. 33 randomized trials, 27,000 plus patients. And this is all about gastrointestinal examinations, specifically around colon cancer. By using the LLMs and computer vision, there was a 50% reduction in missing polyps and adenomas within the colon, which cause colon cancer, right? And it only took an extra 20 seconds of time to be able to have a 50% reduction, right? So again, I could go on and on about all of the improvements around AI in medicine, but here in the Boston area with Mass General Brigham and Beth Israel Deaconess and Harvard Medical School, this is profoundly important for our physicians to know how to use these tools and use them perfectly, okay? AI is infiltrating our medical devices. Here is a massive exponential curve. You look at the number of machine learning and AI that has been incorporated into devices approved by the FDA. It went from literally 18 in 2016 to now 223 per year, and it's growing. And then here, as one example, some of you may have read about this about 3 weeks ago, the first ever live liver transplant was conducted at Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital, which is one of the Harvard Medical School institutions. And basically what they said is they're able to do this very non-invasive liver transplant, which is almost like, really? How do you do that, okay? And so what happened was there was a woman that had cirrhosis of the liver, and rather than getting on the registry, and the registry, you could take many, many years, and many people die waiting, her brother decided to donate part of his liver. And so they have the brother on one table, the recipient on the other table, and in real time, they're doing the liver transplant, okay, aided by an AI-assisted machine, okay? Wow, okay? And then drug discovery. Okay? We live in the world's greatest life sciences cluster, period. Okay? We know Moderna. Okay? They saved us during COVID. Okay? Stefan Bancel was a very early proponent of using AI within the business. And so they decided they would build something called Moderna Chat. It went live on the 18th of May in 2024. And within literally about 3 months, about half of the company was using it. And they actually had a prompt competition to get engagement amongst all their employees, okay? Now that MChat, right, and what they're telling us is that MChat is evolving into an experimentation sandbox because the ChatGPT Enterprise isn't keeping up with their unique needs. So they're actually using this as a sandbox. And then they created literally over 1,000 GPTs, right? And a GPT is just a custom version of a model that you have created so that you can replicate time and time again a task that you want to use, right? And so what they saw was, some of these were getting really significant usage. And so they categorized their top 20 use cases. And one of them was just, as a public company, a self-review GPT gathers monthly and quarterly business review and end-of-year data. Not surprisingly, another one that we see all the time is U.S. benefits assistance, right? So again, the entire company has embraced this capability, okay? And what are the results? The results are stunning, okay? 60% reduction in the development timeline compared to what they normally do when they produce drugs, right? 30% improvement in the yield of their manufacturing process, 50% improvement in quality of the output of their manufacturing process, saving $100 million a year in costs, 40% improvement in resource allocation, okay? So this has really transformed this company. It's a very important Massachusetts-based company, okay? And then here's one of my favorites. So over at MIT, we've got Dr. Jim Collins, who's considered one of the greatest biomedical engineers in the world. And for the last 15 years, he has been fighting the good fight. He's going after MRSA and tuberculosis and sepsis and trying to figure out a way to create new antibiotics that will take strong action against these antibiotic-resistant germs and bacteria. And 15 years he was at it and admittedly made very little progress. And then he partners with Dr. Regina Arziali, who is a deep learning expert at MIT. And they go off and they find 12 million compounds. And they go through a process that would have taken 20 plus years doing it the traditional way. And by doing deep learning in 3 days, they were able to identify 2 compounds that are predicted to have very, very strong action against MRSA and sepsis and tuberculosis, okay, 3 days. Phenomenal, okay? And then, of course, clinical trials, right? 10 years, billions of dollars of time, and now we're starting to see a lot of AI being brought into clinical trials. And here's an example of a local Boston startup called Lotus Health, right? And join us, we're a startup out of MIT and Harvard, reshaping clinical trials with AI agents. Step in as an intern or shape the future as a founding engineer, right? So this is going to be something we're going to see a lot more of. So I think it's indisputable. AI is absolutely central to the future of medicine, healthcare, drug discovery. And I love this quote from Demis Hassabis, who is now a Nobel laureate, the founder of DeepMind. AI can be the end of a disease within the next decade. Now that may sound hyperbolic, but let's look at this man's track record. Let's look at his vision. Let's look what he's done. This is the guy that created AlphaFold. This is the guy that created AlphaGo, okay? We will see the time required to develop drugs shrink from a decade to months. Wow, amazing, okay? Now, the world that I love, startup land, okay? So recently, the New York Times talked about how AI is changing, how Silicon Valley and, of course, Boston, they forgot somehow to put that in the title. So I edited for them here, because, right? But basically, AI is a turbocharger, okay? And so Sam Altman, no tongue-in-cheek, says there's a betting pool with my CEO friends, I bet they're all billionaires, right? Who's going to be the first person to create a one-person company with $1 billion in revenue? Wow. That is not a lifestyle business, okay? Not by any means, okay? And so what we're seeing is extraordinary. Back in the world, the ancient times of 2000 to 2010, we had the human-powered digital platforms like LinkedIn and Airbnb. And to get to $100 million in annual recurring revenue, we needed between 500 and 1,000 people. Okay, that's the headcount that we needed to do that. And then in the era of 2010 to 2020, in this world of product growth or product-led companies, Slack is a great example, Calendly is a great example. It took probably 250 to 300 employees to get there. And now we are seeing companies like Cursor, like Midjourney, like 11 Labs, getting to 100 million in ARR with between 10 and 30 people. Okay? 10 and 30 people. Because the bots are doing a lot of the work. And so Cursor went from 100 million in ARR to 200 million in ARR in 1 quarter. Okay? Last quarter, 100 million. Most recent quarter, 200 million. How many people? 20. Okay? 20 people. Midjourney, they went from 200 million to 500 million. It's $500 million with 10 people. Okay? Think about this. This has changed everything. You cannot start a startup if you don't employ this model. No one will fund you. Okay? Everything is different. So what are the implications for founders? If I have a team of 10 people, I don't need to raise massive amounts of venture capital anymore. I can do this on a shoestring, okay? I don't need to be in, one of the great innovation clusters. I can do this from pretty much anywhere. And here's the thing. Everybody builds. Everybody becomes fluent in these tools. Everybody can build code, okay? All right, so venture capital. We have an incredibly robust VC ecosystem in town, okay? Dave Blunden, some of you may know Dave. Dave runs Link Ventures. Dave has what they call Link Studios at 1 and 2 Kendall Square, okay? And he's saying, and this was just about a week or two ago, he posted, within our studio, our venture studio, a venture studio means super early, we are generating several million lines of code every day. Several million lines of code a day in a venture studio. If we had to pay for that, it would have been $100 million a day in salary. I've never met a raw startup that could afford $100 million a day in AI or software development, okay? So this is where we are today, okay? Flagship pioneering. We all know Flagship, right? Nufar Abian, just a genius. And their contribution to Moderna and so many other treatments is just profound, right? And they're using AI. What they're doing, because they're a venture studio, they look for problems to solve. So they go through massive scientific literature databases to try to identify unmet needs that they can then back into creating a company around, right? So they were very early in doing this, okay? The number of newly funded AI companies by a geographic area, remarkably, US is significantly above everybody else, right? Now, I don't know if anybody heard yesterday, Jensen Huang, the founder of NVIDIA, was interviewed on Bloomberg, I believe it was, and he said, hey, don't be lulled into a false sense of security. The Chinese are neck and neck with us, right? So I don't know how to reconcile this with this, okay? I'm not quite sure how those two things fit together. But I think we're being a little bit complacent if we think that, we can live with this. I don't think this is reality, okay? They have half of the AI researchers in the world are publishing out of China, okay? And then management consulting, okay? McKinsey. They took 100,000 documents. They created this internal capability called Lily. 70% of the consultants are using it. I can't imagine why the other 30% are not. I mean, they must be just, I don't know how you become a McKinsey consultant and don't use these tools. I don't understand the logic there. They're using them 17 times, so 17 times a week, which is still not as much as I would have thought. But they're claiming about a 30% time savings, which is a very consistent data point amongst all companies using these internal, knowledge agents. Okay? And then KPMG in the world of audit, they've deployed about 150 different agents across tax and the audit practice. Now let's talk about software. And Phil told me this morning that there was some question about, do we continue to need coders? Yes, we do. Okay? Let not there be any question about that. But let's get into it. This is how quickly we have moved. 3 years ago, you could autocomplete some small code snippets. 2 years ago, you could fix a broken program. Last year, you could create a new project from scratch. Now, you can automatically understand massive code bases, okay? One of the companies here in town is doing exactly that, okay? One of the Glasswing startups is doing exactly that, okay? You know, code that has been written by thousands of developers at scale in a big company, right? And obviously it's being used by non-professionals today. So let's look at this rate of improvement. From September of 23 until December of 24, using this software engineering bench verified. And verified means it's verified by human beings. This is not some third-party program. This is a human coming and saying, yes, this is accurate, okay? Look at the step function improvement, and all the way up to 03, okay? So it's getting 80% of the code correct on the first shot, okay? 80% of the code on the first shot. Wow, okay? Now, you look at 03, and the top score in this Codeforce's Global Software Development Olympics is 3,000. That's the best you can do. OpenAI's 03 score comes in at 2727, okay? Only one employee at OpenAI has a perfect 3,000 score. And so OpenAI 03 is a better software developer than all but 44 of the best software engineers on the planet. Think about that, okay? And think about how quickly this has happened, okay? So with these tools, you can now build an insanely complex app in about 5 hours, but not if you're a newbie, not if you're a novice. Let's be clear about this, okay? So without naming schools, some of my friends have hired some local interns from some computer science programs within the Boston area. And what they're telling me is oftentimes they don't really know how to code. They've become so reliant on these agentic applications that the minute they run into some kind of bug or error, they're like deer in the headlights. Like, what do I do now, boss? Okay? And so, yes, it's important to remain, well-schooled, to understand the logic path of coding. That's never going to go away. Don't tell your kids this is not the right field of study, okay? I think you want to balance it with maybe a double major, with something like data science or something like that. But you need to know how to code, okay? Anthropic just put out a report this week, okay? And what they're basically saying is they have, right, some of you, how many use Claude Code? Anybody use Claude Code? Okay? So they've got Claude Code, which is an agentic coding tool, versus Claude AI. And what they're showing is that people that are working with Claude Code versus Claude AI, they're doing personal projects and they're doing a lot of startup work, right? That's really where the early adopters are, okay? And what's really interesting is they break it into those people that are doing automation. They're creating code in an automated way. And of course, Claude Code is being used far more significantly when you're talking about direction. You're telling the code what you want it to build. However, for those who are newbies, it's being much more used for learning, task iteration, and validation. So there's this very clear bifurcation between a coding agent like Claude Code and a more typical, AI large language model that you can happen to be able to code with, okay? Now, we're hearing a lot of different things that I think are very controversial. Dario Amodei says in 3 months, AI is writing 90% of the code. Well, he's right numerically, okay? YC Startup, 95% of our code base was AI generated. And then, my CTO will deliver 80% automation and software coding. The last mile is the hardest part, though, okay? That's what people don't understand, okay? So you can't do this without knowing how to code, right? And yes, here's the term du jour. And it's very powerful, right? We see all these vibe coding companies growing at rates we've never seen before, okay? We ran a startup-a-thon in this very room about a month ago, and we had Harvard Business School and MIT Sloan students vibe coding in here, right? They're not technical. They built some amazingly interesting prototypes in about 5 hours, okay? The tools work, right? For prototyping, not for production code, okay? And so here's, just all the students who were, sitting in this room. We had 200 students. We actually had to turn away 100 students. That's how much interest there was, okay? And now you've got job specs for, vibe code. I mean, what is going to be the next job? That's what I want to know, okay? Now, here's the thing, though, right? A lot of these large SaaS companies are at risk because what you have now is you have people that are creating these very, very company-specific, industry-specific workflows. And agentic AI costs about 2% of what a human person would take, okay? And so you're going to see a lot of companies, including our very own beloved HubSpot, under dramatic assault from this new agentic AI revolution. It's, we've already seen, right? Salesforce.com is really struggling right now, as an example, okay? So this is another example if you're in the software industry and you've grown up on the SaaS side of the house. And then, we have, all the research that we're doing in this town until the money got cut off about 2 months ago, right? But, obviously scientific research matters. Google has something called Google Co-Scientist, okay? They're basically providing you with a PhD. Happens to be a bot, okay? And then OpenAI is now soon to ship what they call their PhD level agent. So they will rent you a PhD level agent for $20,000 a month. Wow. It'll be interesting to see if there's any uptake on that, because PhDs don't make $20,000 a month, last I saw, okay? If you know how to negotiate a $20,000 a month salary as a PhD, I'd love to talk to you after this, okay? Okay. All right, so let me quickly move forward here. So where are we going? I want to get to the punchline. Where are we going, right? The AI agents are coming, okay? The midnight ride of Paul Revere 2, okay? Look at the Google search index on AI agents. It was flatline, flatline, flatline. And then, does anybody know why this changed? What was the event that really changed this? What's that?
DeepSeek.
Well, I mean, it was reasoning models in general, whether it be Claude 3.7, whether it be OpenAI 01, or DeepSeek R1, right? This is when agents became real. This is when the LLMs were able to support a level of reasoning that made agents work, okay? And so, one great agent that we all probably have tried, I hope we have tried, is, OpenAI's deep research, right? It's phenomenal. I mean, we've seen examples of PhDs say we do research with this tool, we more or less submit the paper for a peer review, and it gets approved. I mean, wow, okay? So, I'm going to skip through a few things here. But here's an interesting, right? So, we have so many organizations that have finance organizations in them, right? And so this is, how might we use an agent within an organization? Okay, so you're going to have a manager agent, okay, and you'll have an analyst agent, a checker agent, a planner agent. They're all off doing their own work, and they're all reporting back to the manager agent, and we are only dealing specifically with the manager agent. And they then kick off all of this extra work, okay? So it's all about using natural language prompts, okay, to tell them to complete a task. The agent system interprets the prompt. The manager agent subdivides, just like a human manager would do. They go off and to do what they're supposed to do. The team then shares their draft output with the user, and then the agent team receives feedback. It's an iterative loop, right? And we're seeing this dramatically reduce time to completion of a lot of very tedious tasks within the enterprise, okay? This was, again, a KPMG quarterly pulse survey. The number of organizations that are moving from exploring agents to piloting them has doubled to 67% in 1 quarter. So they've really taken off, okay? 99% of all companies, this was about 1,000 CIOs that were queried. 99% of these CIOs are planning to deploy agents, AI agents. The other 1% are going to retire. okay? Or they will be asked to retire, okay? I don't know how you get 1% that don't see this happening, okay? So the future of work. This is amazing. 2 years ago, everybody thought they were going to be a prompt engineer and make $250,000 a year. Well, guess what? That job is dead, okay? So if you're still interviewing or applying for a prompt engineering job, stop, okay? Stop, okay? And so we just saw, right? How many people saw this very famous announcement, okay? Shopify's CEO says no one will be hired unless you can prove that AI can't do the job first. And not to be outdone, the CEO of Duolingo came out just a couple of days ago and said, you hear what the Shopify guy said? Yeah, that's exactly right, okay? So we're seeing this more and more. The message is, if your kids are not having AI skills, they're not going to get jobs, period. You need to be AI fluent to interview today, okay? Automation is coming for a lot of jobs. I tell a lot of my young mentees that I was teaching, I teach a course every summer at Harvard for high school students. I know that you want to be investment banking analysts 4 years from now when you graduate. Those jobs will not exist. Please don't waste daddy's $500,000 on a major that will not lead you to where you want to go, okay? And so here's something I disagree. So these are the core skills that the World Economic Forum says that we will need in 2030. AI and big data, of course, technical literacy, creative thinking. Just go to Eric, he'll teach you how to do that. He'll do it this afternoon. Leadership and social influence, systems thinking, yeah, great. But what I don't get is they've moved programming to being irrelevant. And I just don't think they understand, okay? Which just says you can't believe everything that you hear or read, okay? But not surprisingly, AI skilling and digital labor are the top workforce strategies across the board. And there's many new roles for AI. There's too many, okay? And so people are getting confused, right? Because you have like one role and every company gives it a different title. And so looking for a job is more confusing than ever because you just can't compare. It's not like I'm a product manager or I'm a developer or I'm a head of communications, right? You know what that job is. It's too early for that, okay? So very, very recent research coming out of Harvard and Wharton, the cybernetic teammate. And basically what they did is they went to Procter & Gamble, they interviewed or they ran an experiment with 750 people. And what they said is one person using AI matched the performance of a two-person team without AI. Teams with AI were 3 times more likely to deliver top-tier solutions than teams without. And it's collapsing silos, which is exactly what you want to do in a large company, okay? And so here's my payoff. This is the end. I've got a few more slides, right? I don't know how many people saw this ad in Silicon Valley. Very controversial ad. And the CEO knew exactly what he was doing, okay? And now, you know, here's a company that will rent you bots, okay? You want to hire bots? We got you, okay? And they'll rent you a sales rep, an accountant, a recruiting coordinator, customer success person, research assistant, private equity analyst, okay? That's where we are. And so Microsoft came out just last week with their annual workforce study. And what they basically said is we need to be agent bosses, not mafia bosses, agent bosses, okay? And what does that mean? It means that we have to be familiar with agents. We have to use AI regularly in our daily jobs. We have to be able to trust AI for high-stakes work. We need to expect that we're going to be managing agents. It's no longer optional. It's part of what we do. AI is now a thought partner. It's a career accelerator, and it's going to save us time every day. Okay? And as Kareem Lakhani from Harvard Business School says, as AI democratizes access to expertise and intelligence, we will see the rise of intelligent resource departments. Okay? Much like how HR and IT evolved into core functions. These new divisions will be essential for managing the interplay between humans and AI agents, emerging as a critical source of competitive advantage in the AI-enabled enterprise. Okay? And so, bottom line is, for those, and you're obviously here because you recognize what we have. I'm sure a lot of your family members, a lot of your friends, a lot of your coworkers, maybe not so much, okay? And so nothing in life is to be feared It's only to be understood. And those of us who have chosen to understand how to use AI will be the beneficiaries. We will be the leaders in the new economy, in the new society, in the new world of work. Thank you very much.